let me give a formal introduction before we commence.
That's Tolo Haber.
Yes, wonderful. Professor William Yuan Wang is Chair Professor of Language and Cognitive Sciences at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University and Honorary Professor at several universities, including the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Peking University, Beida. He is Professor Emeritus of the University of California at Berkeley and academician of Academia Sinica in Taiwan. He proposed the theory of lexical diffusion in 1969, which has been widely adopted and applied to many languages of the world. He founded the Journal of Chinese Linguistics in 1973 and served as its editor through to 2018. His interests are in biological bases of language evolution, focusing recently on cognitive decline due to aging and disease. In 2009, he started the series International Conference in Evolutionary Linguistics, promoting multidisciplinary research in linguistics. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award in Anthropology from the Shanghai Society of Anthropology in 2017, an Honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from the University of Chicago in 2018. And we're delighted that Bill is presenting live this morning, and I shall now pass over to him to share his screen and present his talk today from Hong Kong, live.
You can share your screen, Professor.
Okay, can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon, for your kind words. When you invited me to join this workshop, I was really too rash to accept because this is a very new field to me. Nonetheless, I think it's a very good opportunity for me to learn more about this immense and urgent problem that our species is facing. I think a good place to start would be what Brendan has sent to all of the panelists. A lecture that he presented to the APRU, I guess in Indonesia a little bit earlier this year. And that lecture started with the very stark observation. At least 10 million people suffer from dementia in China today. And that number is set to triple by 2050. Those are very stirring words. And I think that we really need to take this very serious problem scientifically as well as societally. I think that Hong Kong U is a particularly appropriate institution to host this conference because right here in China, there was just a few weeks ago, it was announced what the national census tells us. China has a census every 10 years. So this is the 2021 census. And we can compare it with the 2010 census, which is the lowest row shown in this PowerPoint. So as we see, the total population of 2021 census is 1.41 billion. Of these 1.41 billion people, it's broken down into age ranges, 0 to 14, 15 to 59, which I guess is where the bulk of the workforce of the nation must come from, and 60 and above. I looked into the census a little bit more deeply and broke this into two cells, 61 to 64 and greater than 65. So for age greater than 65, we have close to 200 million. And if we include the 61 to 64, this is almost 200 million. If we compare this with the 2010 census, we will see that this large category of elders has increased by 5.44%, whereas the workforce has decreased by 6.79%. And the input to the population, age 0 to 14, has dropped down to 1.35%. Okay. This is something that has many demographers really sounding an alarm, because there's no new input to the workforce, and the present workforce is actually dwindling. Actually, the birth rate in China peaked way back in 1987 at 25.5 million. And this rate has been going down steadily ever since. First, because of the one child per family system introduced in the mid-1980s, and more recently, because of all sorts of socioeconomic factors. Okay. So this has prompted some demographers to characterize this as the emerging demographic abyss for China. Since Hong Kong is located now in this Greater Bay Area, which is actually a new unit that China has been establishing, and I thought we'd share a map so that people can get a rough idea of what is known by what is meant by the Greater Bay Area. As Brendan mentioned, most of my working life, I was in a different Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. But now this is a much, much bigger Greater Bay Area. And the total population in 2019 was 72 million. And Hong Kong is one of the most international places in the world. When I went to take my COVID-19 shot, I was handed a booklet, which is in Chinese, but in addition, there are 10 other orthographies printed, okay, including Indonesian, Tamil, and so on. So it is an area in which new technology, new science can be introduced, and as well as exported. Actually, we have a pretty good survey of the situation of dementia in China. Among these is a team report led by Professor Carol Brain, who gave the first lecture in our workshop. And in this report, the first author is Wu, published in 2018. There's a distinction is drawn between Northern China, Central China, South China, Greater Bay Area, and so on. And all of these have actually different prevalences with respect to dementia. And the authors went on to point out, I think, very appropriately, that these differences provide an opportunity to investigate risk factors at the population level, operating across different life course experiences, and such research could advance global primary prevention of dementia. I think this is a theme that must have been repeated several times over the last few days. Worldwide, of course, there is the 2020 report of the Lancet Commission. I guess Professor Livingston is a panelist in this workshop, and she was the lead author of this commission report. So worldwide, around 50 million people live with dementia, and this number is projected to increase to 152 million by 2050, okay? And these are sometimes numbers lose their effect when they get too large. But to my mind, if you compare with the fact that the entire country of Spain has only 46 million. So 50 million people now with dementia is more than all of the people in Spain. So I started reading into this problem some years ago, trying to learn more about it. And one of the first papers that I read is called An Unsolved Problem of Biology by Peter Medawar. This was Medawar's 1951 inaugural lecture that was delivered at UCL in London. A few years after this paper, Medawar actually went on to win the Nobel Prize in 1960. It was a very thoughtful paper, as well as later on another paper by him at a Cheaper Foundation conference. So in this 1951 paper, he said that the problem I propose to discuss is that of the origin and evolution of what is commonly spoken of as aging. It is a problem of conspicuous sociological importance. Everyone now knows that the proportion of older people in our population is progressively increasing, and that the center of gravity of the population is shifting steadily toward old age. So writing 70 years ago, Medawar already noted that we have already entered a new era in the biological history of the human race. Then later on in the same paper, he proposes to make a lexical distinction between aging and senescence, where aging is kind of biologically neutral, senescence refers to the decline, I think, which is a pretty useful lexical distinction if we want to avoid the confusion. I will include more information in my slides than I will take time to read. So as Brendan was saying, these slides will all be made available, and it contains more information than I can cover here. So this paragraph, for instance, Medawar mentions partly in fun to this novel by Oscar Wilde on Dorian Gray, which exemplifies the distinction between aging and senescence. Another person who I read, Medawar then organized the Chiba Foundation conference a few years after this paper. And in that conference, there's a paper by Aubrey Lewis, 1955, Mental Aspects of Aging. And in this paper, he collected a few examples of kind of great intellectual leaders making their contribution at actually a ripe old age. Verdi composed Othello at 73, and Falstaff at 79. Humboldt wrote the 5 volumes of Cosmos between 76 and 89. Goethe, 70, 80. Galileo, 74. Euler at 72. Laplace, 75, and so on. I think being reminded of these great achievements by elders is a very encouraging thing, at least for those of us who are aging fast. And to this list, I thought I should add another person closer to my studies, and that's Ernst Mayr, who lived 1904 to 2005. And at age 100, he published his very distinguished book, What Makes Biology Unique? The last slide shows a lot of people with mental achievements. Physically, similarly, it's possible to stay very fit, not only cognitive fit, but physically fit. So here's a man called Tom Lane, 100 years old, competing in a 100 yards backstroke. It's again, invigorating to have such examples frequently brought up. In addition to reading Medawar and people of those years, another paper that has impressed me a lot is by this evolutionary geneticist, George Williams, his famous book, Adaptation and Natural Selection. This famous paper, published in 1957 on pleiotropy, natural selection, and the evolution of senescence, brought home to me a very interesting concept, which Williams called antagonistic pleiotropy. I actually was given a fine example of this at a conference that Brendan organized at Hong Kong U a few years ago, when some of the speakers brought up the gene APOE epsilon 4 to be an example of antagonistic pleiotropy. The idea is that there are certain genes with many, many traits. That's what pleiotropy means. Some of these traits may be quite advantageous when you're young, below the, still in the reproductive age, but the same genes produce other genes, other traits, which are actually bad for you. So APOE epsilon 4 helps your cognitive acuity when you're young, but increases your risk for Alzheimer's when you're old. Such interesting phenomena I did not think about before, and it's interesting that we can tie genetics into aging more and more solidly. The people who have aged well go way beyond 100. For instance, is Jean Carnot, very famous, okay, lived 122 years, 164 days. Closer to my field, there's Zhou Youguang, who more than anybody else popularized the way of writing Chinese in Roman letters, Hanyu Pinyin, who died just several years ago at age 111. But not everybody is a Tom Lane swimming the 100-yard backstroke or Calmont. Actually, many are much less fortunate. So here's a coronal section of a healthy brain. But because of senescence, cognitive decline, neuronal atrophy, all sorts of unfortunate events, this brain reduces to something like this, where the ventricles have become much enlarged. Regions of subcortical structures, such as the hippocampal formation, much reduced. White matter and gray matter, again, also atrophy. If we take a look at the brain across various structures, this diagram shows us the ventricles have greatly enlarged. On the other hand, the entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus formation, and several other subcortical structures have atrophied to a large extent. And of the 4 hemispheric lobes, the frontal lobe is the one that takes the hardest hit. So it was around first part of the last century that the worst culprit in dementia, which is Alzheimer's disease, accounting for 60–70% of dementia. Okay. This was discovered by Alois Alzheimer, and he identified the 2 pathogens. Okay. This is the black arrow showing the plaques, amyloid, beta amyloid, the red arrow showing the tau intracellularly, and this is actually Alzheimer actually had slides of these things in his 1911 paper, but this is a much clearer, much more recent micrograph with a magnification of 100 times so that we can see it in much greater detail. So I'm sure many panelists have referred to the Lancet Commission report, and the 2020 report added 3 new risk factors for dementia, including these 3: excessive alcohol consumption, head injury, air pollution, and so on, adding these to the earlier 9 that they mentioned back in 2017. Okay. Some of these, of course, are relatively easy to control, such as alcohol consumption, such as smoking. But things like air pollution, which is really very serious and is definitely a strong risk factor for dementia, that requires a much more concerted action by our species to to bring into order. At a more biological level than the Lancet report, in the journal Cell a few years ago, Lopez-Otin presented 9 what's called the hallmarks of aging. And these hallmarks have been generally accepted in the literature. And they're listed here. And for instance, telomerase attrition. Telomeres, of course, are the short pieces of DNA that cap our chromosomes. And a few decades ago, it was discovered that when cells divide to form new cells, the telomeres shorten. And if they keep on shortening, the cell division becomes no longer viable. And there's a man called Hayflick, Leonard Hayflick. There's a Hayflick limit to how much telomeres can shorten. And the study of this one feature, for instance, won 3 people at UCSF a Nobel Prize. I will not take the time to read over these things that I have provided in this PowerPoint. But here, for instance, 3 of the hallmarks: cellular senescence, stem cell exhaustion, altered intercellular communication, which the authors have explained quite well with their diagrams, showing that how young people and old people differ across these hallmarks. And these hallmarks have been written up in greater detail in many places. Because there's a growing alarm at this problem of aging, its immense nature and its urgency, funding agencies, government agencies are beginning to take action to try to face these challenges. For instance, in the US, there was the establishment of the National Institute of Aging that has been relatively generous in funding this new field. And just this year, the famous Nature magazine has started a new series called Nature Aging. Here's the January issue this year. Here's the next issue. And here's the issue just came out a few weeks ago called Cellular and Proteomic Profiling of Aging and of COVID-19. Because the Lancet Commission Report 2020 also touched on the impact of COVID-19 on elders as opposed to people in other age categories. Side by side, alongside with these developments, the field has branched out in all sorts of new directions. For instance, there's a new multi-million-dollar industry now on helping you train your brain health by playing games, especially video games. So Angara made the cover of Nature magazine in 2013, talking about video game training enhances cognitive control in older adults. Very shortly after this paper, there was a commentary section in Nature in which skeptics do not believe that video games are all that useful, saying that it's probably better for your brain health to go out and take a walk in fresh air. Unsworth is a critical article, critical discussion directed against video games. Okay, it playing video games related to cognitive abilities. And just last year, a very, very large meta-analysis was published in a Journal of Experimental Psychology with the title, Brain Training Habits Are Not Associated with Generalized Benefits to Cognition. Okay. Nonetheless, every day I get various publicity, commercials, advertisements from companies like Lumosity, New Neuron, and things like that, inviting people to play games and train their brains. Okay. This is an area that should reach some consensus soon so that the public will not stay in a state of confusion. In addition to the hallmarks mentioned by, published by Lopez-Otten, there's another paper just published this year, which analyzes the causal relation between genes and various types of mental decline. This diagram, I think, is very useful. Here's part of the explanation of it. It says it's a multifactorial interaction between the identified genes and the imaging modalities. So the innermost circle here in this 3 concentric circles, the innermost circle shows the longitudinal biological factor changes with AD. The middle ring displays the interacting biological factors driving the longitudinal alterations. And the outermost ring, okay, represents the causal genes, the many of them, modulating the interactions among the biological factors. Okay. I think this, I just downloaded this article not very long ago, and I will certainly go back and read it with much greater care. Another direction of development is optogenetic therapy. Okay. Here's a paper just published again last month, saying partial recovery of visual function in a blind patient after optogenetic therapy. Okay. We're aware that gene therapy has become a much larger therapeutic methodology with the CRISPR methods advanced recently and which won the Nobel Prize. Okay. Yet another area of development, I'm just enumerating 4 or 5 areas of development which are relevant to our field, okay, is the discovery of methods to induce pluripotent stem cells. This was primarily led recently in Kyoto University by Yamanaka Shinya, who was the senior author in a paper published in 2007 called Successful Induction of Pluripotent Stem Cells First Demonstrated in Humans. And this was published in 2007. 5 years later, Yamanaka and others for this development won the Nobel Prize in 2012. And the 4 factors that Yamanaka discovered are now called Yamanaka factors, and they're listed in this slide. Okay, now, after this relatively broad survey, I will try to focus a little bit more on a particular strand of development. This has to do with David Sinclair, who is a geneticist at Harvard University. When his book came out a few years ago called Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, it caught my attention, especially because of this subtitle. And it turns out he's advocating a view of aging based on information theory. He's saying that we age, we have all sorts of bodily and neural decline because of the loss of information in our genes. If it's possible to go and recover some of that information, then we can reprogram genes in order to regain youth. And in fact, this is what he claims. And his paper, December last year, made the cover of Nature magazine called Turning Back Time. This article is authored by several dozen people, with David Sinclair as the final author. It also includes somebody called Steve Horvath, who has been very influential in proposing something called the epigenetic clock. And the point of this article, Turning Back Time, is stated very clearly in the abstract. They used 3 of the 4 Yamanaka factors, OCT4, SOX2, and so on, and they called it the OSK method based on these 3 factors. And they were able to promote axon regeneration after injury and reverse vision loss in a mouse model of glaucoma as well as in aged mice. Okay. So our caution must be, of course, that this very sensational achievement has been done in mice. Although mice are genetically quite similar to humans, nonetheless, extending it to humans might be more than simple generalization. I think somehow I skipped this slide, which I think I should show. Stephen Horvath is a professor at UCLA, and his 2013 paper, DNA Methylation Age of Human Tissues and Cell Types. And this diagram from that paper shows that no matter where the tissue comes from in the human body, from the arm, from the leg, from the hand, and so on, there is a consistency with respect to methylation. And from this consistency, we can derive something that he calls epigenetic age, which is a much better indication of a person's health than the chronological age. And my purpose in my wish was to combine Horvath at UCLA, Yamanaka in Kyoto, and Sinclair in Boston, see that how science can bring various distant working groups together in order to achieve a very stunning result, like this paper, Turning Back Time. If this works, of course, it means that we can go back and back and back, and in principle, become immortal. It's like what the jellyfish can do with its parts. Of course, we are a lot more complicated than jellyfish, but the principles are the same. Okay, for the last few slides, I'd like to briefly go over some of the things that we do in Hong Kong, me and my team. Okay. We are members of this thing called Research Center for Language, Cognition, and Neuroscience. And Professor Brandon Weeks was kind enough to come and give a talk to this research center before the pandemic on his contributions to this area. So roughly, the guiding light for our research is to consider the brain, cognition, and language, how the three interact with each other. And we use these tools like EEG, which we've been using for quite a while now. MRI, PolyU has just acquired a completely operational MRI on our campus, which really facilitates our work because it's much more convenient to use and much, much cheaper than going elsewhere. We also have eye tracking. And we're thinking of adding to our bag of tools various forms of brain stimulation. And we've been studying the cognitive domains of inhibitory control. Okay. I think quite often cognitive decline means you are more distracted by irrelevant stimuli. You cannot inhibit them. And you're losing by the weakening of cognitive control. Important aspect of cognition is working memory, attention, executive functions of the prefrontal cortex. All these things are of interest to us. And we try to use these tools, investigate these cognitive domains by looking at various language skills, including semantic skills, phonological awareness skills, music skills, and lexical tones, and so on. And as we do our research, we keep in mind a lesson that was very eloquently taught by Joseph Henrich and his group in Canada. First, a short article in Nature called "Most People Are Not Weird," and a much more extended discussion of this in The Weirdest People in the World, and that was in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences, about 60 or 70 pages of discussion. Okay. The word weird they use is an acronym formed from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Okay. They point out that so much what we know about the psychology, about the neuropathology, and so on, that's in the scientific literature comes mostly to a large extent from North America and Europe. And in Hong Kong, in China, we must remember that Chinese culture and Chinese languages are quite distinct from the context in which the weird studies have been made. Some may be in common. If there are differences, we ought to know what these differences are. So this is the context of our research at PolyU. As an example, we used paradigms like the flanker test. The flanker test, the subject is presented with visual stimuli on a computer screen, and he's supposed to say whether the middle arrow here is pointing to the left or to the right, and press different keys according to that decision. The trick to this experimental method, of course, is that this middle arrow is embedded in other arrows, which may be congruent with it or incongruent with it. If you are good in your inhibitory control, then you will be better in making these decisions. You'll be able to show a sharper brain response and an earlier brain response. And this is indeed what we find, okay? Here is one of the electrodes, FZ, on the frontal lobe. And for young people, the congruent and incongruent, show a very sharp negative peak, whereas the older people is much slower, the peak is less, and it's later, maybe 15, 20, 50 milliseconds later in time. We use this method also to use other subjects. For instance, here we use subjects who are bilinguals. Okay? We want to know that if bilinguals who switch between languages back and forth all the time, having to inhibit the non-wanted language, okay, how will they do in such experiments of congruence and incongruence? Another method that we used is the so-called Stroop test. Here's a Chinese sinogram. It's written in red, and the subject is supposed to say red, but the sinogram actually says blue. So blue is the interference. How well can you inhibit that? And here are some of the papers that we published, including one just this year in Brain and Language. We are also doing various things on semantic processing. These are two, in Hong Kong, they're called Research Grants Committee, okay, RGC. Currently we have two RGCs. In one, we're doing connectome studies on semantic processing, okay, using various semantic categories, okay, and monitoring the activity of these areas and monitoring their co-activity in various stimulation conditions. In another RGC study, which is still going on, we're comparing young learners and old learners as they try to learn Italian. These are subjects who may know native speakers of Cantonese, also proficient in Mandarin and English, but who do not know Italian. And they're taught Italian, and we see how their brains are activating as they learn a new language. And again, and this is also found quite a bit in the literature, the young learners use very different connections in the brain from the old learners. To go back to Horvath again, Horvath, you remember, invented the epigenetic clock. And in doing that, he measured the methylation in various tissues in the human body. Here are some old people, 80 and above, 95 and above, 110 above. Horvath actually had thousands of subjects. And here he measured age acceleration. Here it means it's faster than the chronological age. Negative means it's slower, more conservative. And what's especially striking here, which we found very puzzling, is that the cerebellum, which is a small brain in the back of the head, as you get older and older, while other cells continue to age, the cerebellum becomes younger and younger relatively. We feel that this is a very fertile cue telling us that the cerebellum is really a very fertile territory, and we plan to apply for funding to study the cerebellum specifically. It's been kind of the neglected portion of the human brain, and it plays a very important part in language. The last item of our current research that we will want to extend in the future has to do with something with a measure called largest Lyapunov exponent, LLE, which we borrowed from chaos theory. Working with Professor Ron Chan at CityU, who is a world expert on chaos theory, we find that even with EEG, we can see a very clear trend of aging, but the aging differs according to region of the brain, especially prominent in the prefrontal area. Okay, I'm sorry I'm running a little bit over. 2 more slides. Return to the theme of our workshop, intervention and prevention. It goes without saying that intervention and prevention must be based on sound scientific understanding of neurodegenerative disease. The better the science, the better the translation of its findings to the home, the clinic, and the hospital. It's encouraging that many disparate disciplines are now joining hands in research toward deepening our understanding, such as shown in our present workshop. Our understanding of such concepts as cognitive reserve, cognitive decline are deepening steadily, and this workshop will surely encourage and enhance such research. I want to mention that at PolyU, we're setting up an online bibliography of cognitive decline in language. Okay, we're doing this primarily to serve the field at large, but also to help Chinese colleagues in Greater China, keep up with the international literature. So our bibliography is actually bilingual, and anybody is welcome to access it without password at this web address. And lastly, I'd like to thank my research team, Manson Fong, who is behind most of this research, Ivan interested in language and music and cognitive decline. Matthew, who did most of the work on Lyapunov exponents. Rosa, who is our internal expert on bilingualism, and Kianda actually is doing cognitive decline in Swahili. In fact, right now she's in Tanzania, unable to return, separated from us by the pandemic. Well, thank you very much. I apologize for the overtime.
It's our great pleasure to receive your wisdom, Professor Wang, and I'm very delighted to have heard such an enormous amount of preparation and work that you put into your excellent and outstanding discussion this morning. We do, unfortunately, not have very much time, but I would like to relay a couple of questions, one from Brazil. Let me read it out to you, from my colleague Lillian Hübner, a linguist. Dr. Wang, thank you for this amazing talk. Could you please give us your point of view on how the stimulation of reading and writing habits could improve cognitive skills?
I think stimulating the brain with written language clearly has benefits, but the benefits would differ depending on how the experiment is set up and depending on the particular writing system. For instance, in comparing a writing system like Chinese, which is also used in Japan, there's more inhibitory influence than a writing system like English or Portuguese, which uses the Latin alphabet. To give an example, in our Stroop test, for instance, here's a word. The word is written in blue, and you're supposed to say red. We find the Stroop test much, much more inhibiting for Chinese readers than for American readers. Okay, so I would encourage a lot of experiments and a lot of studies with the written language in addition to spoken language. But it's important. It's important to distinguish different types of writing systems.
Oh, thank you again. Another question from Brazil. We have a very large number of registrants from Brazil, which is pleasing. And
thanks to Teresa, maybe.
Oh, very much so, yes. And this question comes from Brenda Lunardi. Regarding the optogenetics therapy techniques, are these findings you report in basic research to bring benefits to the aged population?
That report is brand new. I have not studied it in great detail, but it's very interesting. What they found is that it's possible to tailor a gene so that the gene will express itself when it's in a condition of the right kind of light. And if you shine the light, the gene expresses itself, the gene will do its work. So as far as I read that article, it doesn't seem to be age restricted. So even though that study is just on the visual system of normal adults, I see no reason why in principle it cannot be extended optogenetically to help old people.
Thank you so much. A wonderful recommendation. Thank you very much again. We have to pass on to the next presenter as we are on a tight schedule today. But please join me in thanking Bill for stimulating our thoughts this morning and helping our brain stay a little younger. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you, Brendan. Come back soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.